Luca Romano, Sofia Vitale, and Enzo Moretti, three names whispered in fear across continents, aren't just mafia leaders. They are the architects of a new criminal empire, one that has quietly turned 2026 into the year organized crime became unstoppable. The final months of 2025 created an unusual calm in the criminal underworld. Law enforcement agencies celebrated what they believed were the decline of Italy's most feared mafia families. Major arrests, frozen bank accounts, and heavily publicized trials painted a picture of collapse. To the public, it seemed like decades of crime had finally caught up to the organization. Streets were quieter, ports were under stricter watch, and politicians proudly announced that organized crime was losing its grip. But deep beneath this controlled silence, a hidden transformation was taking shape, one far more dangerous than anything seen before. The mafia understood that old methods could no longer survive intense surveillance. Instead of resisting, they stepped back and let the world believe they were defeated. This illusion became their greatest weapon. Leaders who once relied on intimidation began to redirect their resources into areas no one was monitoring. They quietly pulled money out of traditional criminal markets and pushed it into legal industries that offered both profit and protection. Construction companies, tech startups, medical suppliers, and logistics firms became new hiding places for their financial operations. These businesses looked clean from the outside, and that made them perfect shields. As investigators focused on arresting street-level workers, the top leaders disappeared from public attention. They communicated through coded financial transactions, leaving no trace of meetings, calls, or messages. Safe houses were replaced by virtual networks, and old loyalties were replaced by strategic partnerships. The families no longer fought over neighborhoods. They fought for influence inside corporate boards, trade markets, and financial systems. It was a new kind of power, silent, invisible, and almost impossible to detect. The shift spread gradually across Europe. Criminal activities that once depended on violence were now driven by numbers, investments, and international banking laws. The mafia's accountants became more essential than any enforcer. They studied loopholes in regulations, moved funds through shell companies, and used offshore accounts to hide millions. Governments could track weapons, drugs, and people, but they struggled to follow money that never stayed in one place. Each transaction brought the families closer to financial dominance. Behind all this change was a single goal: survival through evolution. The mafia no longer aimed to control streets. They aimed to control systems. By spreading their operations across multiple countries, they reduced the risk of exposure. If one location was compromised, another silently took over. This structure created a chain of hidden opportunities, each one feeding the next. The calm that authorities celebrated was not the end of the mafia, but the beginning of its reinvention. The silence covering Europe was carefully engineered to distract the world from a deeper and more strategic expansion. While governments praised themselves for weakening organized crime, the families were preparing to enter 2026 with tools far more powerful than guns or threats. They had learned that real strength came from being underestimated, and in that underestimated space, they were building the foundation for a new era of influence that no one was ready to confront. As the old mafia bosses faded from the public eye, a new generation quietly stepped into power. These were not men and women defined by brutality or impulsive violence. They were educated, calculated, and determined to reshape the family legacy. Unlike their predecessors, who relied heavily on fear and intimidation, this new leadership understood the modern world. They had studied finance, technology, international trade, and political systems, often earning degrees in prestigious institutions while secretly maintaining ties to the underworld. Their education gave them an advantage. They could operate in plain sight, creating an image of legitimate business acumen while secretly consolidating criminal influence. This generation brought with it a new mindset. Patience replaced aggression, strategy replaced chaos, and discretion replaced flamboyance. Instead of engaging in violent turf wars, they focused on building networks and alliances that crossed national borders. They identified influential businessmen, politicians, and legal professionals who could be persuaded, coerced, or bribed into assisting them. Every alliance was carefully calculated for maximum benefit and minimum exposure. In this way, the families became more than just criminal organizations. They transformed into invisible corporations that controlled multiple layers of society, from street-level crime to international finance. Technology became their secret weapon. While the older generation depended on word-of-mouth instructions and face-to-face meetings, the younger leaders leveraged encrypted communications, anonymous banking, and complex financial algorithms. They could move large sums of money without attracting attention and coordinate operations in multiple countries simultaneously. Their sophistication made them almost untouchable by traditional law enforcement, which still operated on outdated models of tracking criminal activity. Every decision was backed by data, every move backed by risk analysis, and every expansion calculated to maximize profit while minimizing exposure. The new leaders also understood the importance of public perception. They invested in legitimate businesses, donated to charities, and even attended high-profile social events, creating a facade of respectability that masked their criminal activities. By appearing as entrepreneurs and philanthropists, they avoided suspicion and gained access to networks previously closed to organized crime. This careful curation of their public image allowed them to infiltrate sectors that were once impossible to touch, from banking and real estate to high-end logistics and technology. At the same time, they redefined loyalty within the families. Unlike the old system, which often relied on fear and unquestioning obedience, these young leaders rewarded intelligence, initiative, and discretion. Operatives who demonstrated skill in managing resources, avoiding attention, and generating profit were quickly promoted, regardless of age or bloodline. This merit-based structure made the organizations more agile and adaptable. It also reduced internal conflict, as members understood that strategy and results mattered more than brute force. By the end of 2025, this new generation had solidified its grip. They had created a complex web of influence that stretched far beyond Italy, connecting with networks in Eastern Europe, South America, and Asia. Rival gangs and criminal organizations, once isolated, now found themselves entangled in a larger system they barely understood. The young Mafia leaders were no longer just heirs to a violent legacy. They had become architects of a new era, one where power was measured not by guns or intimidation, but by strategy, stealth, and the high ability to manipulate the world's most powerful systems from the shadows. Their calculated rise ensured that as 2026 approached, the Mafia was not weakened. It was reborn, smarter, and more dangerous than ever. Technology had become the greatest ally of the Mafia's new leadership. While law enforcement agencies continued to rely on traditional methods, wiretaps, surveillance, and informants, the families had embraced the digital age in ways few outsiders could imagine. They no longer needed to meet in dark alleys or whisper instructions across tables. Instead, they operated through encrypted networks, secure messaging applications, and sophisticated financial software designed to leave no trace. Every transaction, every instruction, and every alliance could be executed with precision, speed, and secrecy, reducing the risk of exposure to almost zero. The Mafia's investment in technology went far beyond communication. They hired hackers, software engineers, and cybersecurity experts to monitor and manipulate systems for their benefit. These specialists were responsible for creating secure pathways for money transfers, tracking potential law enforcement investigations, and even predicting vulnerabilities in financial and corporate networks. By controlling information digitally, the Mafia had created an advantage that no traditional crime group had ever possessed. While other organizations relied on intimidation and brute force, the new generation relied on intelligence, data, and timing. Financial operations were particularly revolutionary. Digital currencies, offshore banking, and coded transactions allowed the families to move millions of euros across the globe without raising suspicion. Shell companies and virtual accounts acted as layers of protection, making it nearly impossible to trace money back to its source. Each transfer was carefully timed and disguised as legitimate business activity. These operations allowed the Mafia to invest in legal markets, fund expansion projects, and maintain liquidity for criminal activities, all while remaining invisible to authorities. In essence, they were building an empire inside systems that governments were ill-prepared to monitor. Beyond money, technology also strengthened internal control. Leaders could monitor the movements of their members, track shipments, and analyze risk without leaving their homes or offices. Automated systems provided alerts for suspicious activity, giving bosses the ability to intervene before problems escalated. Even high-ranking officials could be kept in line digitally, with evidence of missteps or misconduct collected silently and stored securely for leverage. This combination of surveillance and strategy gave the Mafia unparalleled power over both internal and external threats. Cybercrime became another frontier. Ransomware, identity theft, and digital extortion were used not merely for profit, but as tools of influence. Corporations, small businesses, and even governments found themselves vulnerable to threats they could neither fully understand nor defend against. The Mafia didn't always use these tools openly. Often, the mere threat of exposure or financial loss was enough to ensure compliance. Through digital control, they could manipulate outcomes in ways that violence alone could never achieve. Even traditional crimes were enhanced through technology. Smuggling networks now relied on GPS tracking, drone reconnaissance, and encrypted supply chains to move goods undetected. Counter-surveillance techniques were applied to evade law enforcement, and advanced software predicted the movements of rivals and authorities alike. Every operation was mapped, every risk calculated, and every opportunity exploited with surgical precision. By embracing technology, the Mafia had transformed from a secretive criminal organization into a shadow network that could operate globally without detection. Their knowledge of digital systems created a barrier between themselves and anyone trying to stop them. Violence was no longer their primary tool. Information, control, and invisibility were. As 2026 approached, their mastery of technology had positioned them not just to survive, but to dominate, proving that the Mafia's evolution was no longer defined by fear alone, but by intelligence, innovation, and an almost invisible grip on power. The Mafia's expansion in 2025 did not stop at technology or finance. While Europe remained their core base, leaders understood that survival and power required global reach. Instead of engaging in bloody conflicts over territories, the families sought strategic alliances with other criminal organizations worldwide. South America, Eastern Europe, and parts of Asia became key partners in this quiet unification. These alliances were not publicized. They were carefully orchestrated through intermediaries, shell companies, and covert communication networks. By merging operations, rival networks that had once clashed violently now worked in synchrony, creating a system that was far larger and more organized than anything previously seen. One of the most significant areas of cooperation was in logistics. Shipping routes, previously vulnerable to interception and theft, were now controlled jointly by Mafia-led networks. Containers carrying both legal and illegal goods moved seamlessly across ports, often disguised as ordinary commercial shipments. The coordination allowed the families to diversify their operations. Drugs, counterfeit currency, stolen art, and rare commodities flowed through these channels with minimal risk of detection. By consolidating control, they effectively eliminated competition in key regions while maintaining plausible deniability for every transaction. The unification also extended into resource exploitation. Illegal mining operations in Africa, gold smuggling in South America, and counterfeit electronics manufacturing in Asia were integrated into the Mafia's broader network. Each regional partner contributed expertise, local influence, and infrastructure, while the families coordinated profits and risk management from Europe. This network created an invisible supply chain that was nearly impossible for authorities to disrupt. Even when one operation was exposed, the larger system absorbed the impact without collapsing. What made this global merge truly revolutionary was the shift from violent dominance to financial and strategic control. The old Mafia fought turf wars, but this new model treated territory as a network of opportunities. Influence over key ports, political figures, and logistical hubs mattered more than control of streets or neighborhoods. The families could now operate in dozens of countries simultaneously, leveraging local groups without direct interference. Each partnership was mutually beneficial, ensuring that every player had a stake in maintaining the system rather than undermining it. Communication across these regions was carefully managed. Encrypted platforms, intermediaries, and coded messages ensured that instructions were clear but traceable only within the network. Leaders could coordinate multi-continent operations in real time, while law enforcement agencies struggled to piece together isolated incidents. Even intelligence leaks or informants had limited effect, as the network was decentralized enough to continue functioning despite minor disruptions. This global integration also opened doors to legal markets. By blending criminal operations with legitimate businesses, the families laundered vast sums of money while gaining influence in international trade and finance. Ports, shipping companies, import-export firms, and real estate conglomerates all became conduits for both profit and control. Governments and banks, unaware of the full scope of the alliances, often treated these organizations as ordinary business partners, giving the Mafia unprecedented access to resources and opportunities. By the end of 2025, this quiet unification had created a shadow empire. The Mafia was no longer confined to Europe. It had become a global network with influence that spanned continents. Violence had become secondary, replaced by strategy, alliances, and economic dominance. Law enforcement's focus on individual countries and local operations left them blind to the true scale of the organization. As 2026 approached, the Mafia had achieved something unprecedented. It had transformed from a regional criminal network into a global power structure, invisible, untouchable, and more dangerous than ever before. As 2025 progressed, the Mafia recognized that political and economic instability created opportunities far more valuable than any illegal shipment or violent conquest. Governments across Europe and beyond were struggling with inflation, social unrest, and the fallout from global crises. The new leadership saw a chance to extend their influence not through fear, but through manipulation, persuasion, and money. Instead of relying on brute force, they targeted vulnerable politicians, struggling municipalities, and key public officials, embedding themselves deep within the systems that governed everyday life. Bribery became more sophisticated. Rather than offering cash for favors, the Mafia used investments, loans, and promises of economic growth to sway decision-makers. Construction projects, energy contracts, and public tenders became tools of influence. Entire development zones in major cities were subtly directed by Mafia-backed companies, giving the families control over both finances and political alliances. Officials who accepted these deals often believed they were working with legitimate investors, unaware that the true architects of the operations were criminal masterminds. This method of influence created long-term leverage, ensuring that government decisions, legal approvals, and regulatory oversight could be subtly directed to serve the Mafia's interests. The families also mastered the art of infiltration. They placed loyal operatives in strategic positions within corporations, banks, and public offices. These individuals gathered critical information, influenced policy decisions, and ensured that key transactions went unnoticed. With insiders in place, The Mafia could monitor law enforcement actions, anticipate audits, and manipulate legal processes to their advantage. Even high-level investigations were often redirected or delayed because those within the system ensured that nothing threatened the broader network. This level of penetration made the Mafia almost untouchable. Economic crises, in particular, became a playground for manipulation. Small businesses struggling to survive were offered financial support, often under the guise of loans or investments. These seemingly helpful arrangements came with hidden obligations. Owners and managers found themselves indebted in ways that extended far beyond money control over contracts. Influence over hiring and alignment with Mafia interests became part of the bargain. Slowly, entire sectors began to operate under the influence of the families without realizing it. International influence also increased. By funding elections or supporting political campaigns abroad, the Mafia gained allies in foreign governments, creating safe zones for money laundering, shipping, and expansion. Their ability to maneuver across borders without legal interference gave them a global advantage. The old methods of law enforcement, focused on isolated criminal acts, were ineffective against a network that could manipulate politics, finance, and industry simultaneously. By the end of 2025, the Mafia's approach to corruption had shifted from opportunistic bribery to systematic domination. Violence had become a tool of last resort, rarely necessary in an environment where influence, money, and strategic placement could accomplish the same goals without attracting unwanted attention. Governments continued to boast about victories against organized crime, but in reality, the families had extended their control deeper than ever, quietly shaping policy, economics, and society to suit their needs. This subtle, far-reaching infiltration marked a turning point. The Mafia had transformed from a criminal organization dependent on intimidation into a shadow power capable of influencing nations from the inside. As 2026 approached, the families were no longer just a threat. They had become an invisible force shaping governments, economies, and communities. Their strength lay not in guns or gangs, but in their ability to control systems, manipulate opportunities, and operate unseen, making them more powerful than at any time in recent history. The disappearance of the journalist marked a turning point in the public perception of organized crime. Known for investigating suspicious financial networks, the journalist had been tracking unusual transfers and offshore accounts connected to companies that appeared legitimate on the surface. The project had been extensive, involving months of research, interviews, and data collection. No one expected that the pursuit of truth would result in a complete vanishing, leaving no trace except for a few scattered clues that pointed toward a massive, well-protected network. The case shocked not only the public, but also authorities who had assumed that organized crime operated within traditional, predictable frameworks. As news of the disappearance spread, pressure mounted on law enforcement agencies to act. Investigators combed through bank records, corporate filings, and travel logs, hoping to find leads. Instead, what they discovered only heightened the mystery. The journalist's files, partially recovered from cloud servers and encrypted backups, revealed the vast reach of the Mafia's operations. Secret offshore companies, coded financial transactions, and a complex network of international collaborators indicated a level of organization that exceeded anything previously imagined. It became evident that the disappearance was not an isolated event, but part of a broader strategy to protect the network's interests. The documents showed that the Mafia had infiltrated multiple sectors, including shipping, logistics, construction, and banking. Each layer of the operation was meticulously structured to appear legitimate, making detection extremely difficult. Coded communications suggested coordination between leaders in Europe, South America, and Asia. Evidence of bribery, political influence, and legal manipulation was abundant, yet it was carefully disguised. Attempting to expose it risked triggering backlash from those within the system who were quietly complicit. The journalist had unknowingly uncovered a network so intertwined with global commerce and governance that even minor revelations could have far-reaching consequences. The international community began to notice the implications. Media outlets speculated about the journalist's fate, while experts debated the extent of organized crime's influence. The exposure, however, did not weaken the Mafia. On the contrary, it reinforced their control. Corporations, banks, and political figures grew cautious, realizing that any investigation or challenge could draw unwanted attention and place them in danger. Fear became another tool of influence, ensuring that institutions avoided confrontation with the network. The disappearance had a chilling effect, effectively silencing many who might have pursued similar investigations. Despite public outrage, law enforcement struggled to piece together actionable leads. The network's decentralized structure meant that even when one operation was exposed, others continued without interruption. Informants were rare, and those who did attempt to cooperate often faced intimidation or disappearance themselves. Each revelation uncovered by the journalist only highlighted the depth of the organization's reach, demonstrating that the Mafia was no longer confined to local or regional activity. It had become a sophisticated, global entity capable of controlling events from the shadows. By the end of the investigation, it was clear that the disappearance had inadvertently cemented the Mafia's power. The journalist's exposure showed the world the true scale of their operations, but it also intimidated anyone who might challenge them. Through fear, secrecy, and strategic control, the families ensured that even the most well-intentioned efforts to uncover their activities were met with insurmountable obstacles. The event marked a new era in organized crime, one in which influence, information, and intimidation worked hand in hand to maintain dominance, proving that the Mafia's reach had grown far beyond what authorities and the public had ever imagined. As the world faced increasing natural disasters and political conflicts in 2025, the Mafia saw opportunities where others saw chaos. Instead of ignoring these crises, the families moved swiftly to position themselves as indispensable players in the regions affected. Humanitarian crises, war-torn zones, and disaster-stricken areas became fertile ground for expansion. Disguised as aid providers, the Mafia supplied food, water, medical supplies, and construction materials. To the public and local governments, these interventions appeared generous and necessary, offering relief to populations desperate for assistance. In reality, every shipment, contract, and interaction was carefully designed to strengthen control over resources and people. The families quickly realized the crises allowed them to operate without the usual scrutiny. Traditional law enforcement and oversight bodies were often overwhelmed or absent in these regions. The Mafia exploited this vacuum, creating influence networks that infiltrated local authorities, private contractors, and even international aid organizations. By providing essential supplies and services, they gained trust and credibility, positioning themselves as figures of authority. Local populations, unaware of the hidden motives behind the assistance, often welcomed their presence, which further solidified the family's control. Control over supply chains became the true profit driver. Every shipment of goods entering these areas was tracked and manipulated to maximize revenue. High-value items were diverted for illicit trade, while resources necessary for survival were strategically withheld or priced to benefit Mafia-backed enterprises. By monopolizing these channels, the families were able to maintain power over both the economy and the population. This approach allowed them to expand influence without resorting to traditional criminal tactics like intimidation or violence. The recruitment of local populations also played a critical role. Many people affected by crises were left unemployed, homeless, or desperate for income. The Mafia offered work opportunities that appeared legitimate, unloading shipments, distributing aid, or helping with construction projects. These roles were carefully designed to foster loyalty, dependence, and silence. Workers who might otherwise resist or report illegal activities were now invested in the success of the operation, unknowingly contributing to a hidden criminal network that controlled entire regions. Crisis zones also became testing grounds for the Mafia's global expansion strategies. Operations in politically unstable countries allowed the families to experiment with new methods of infiltration, digital surveillance, and financial manipulation. Lessons learned from these regions were later applied to more stable markets, creating a flexible and adaptive system that could be replicated anywhere. By embedding themselves within emergency response systems, the families blurred the line between humanitarian work and organized crime, making detection extremely difficult. Even international observers were deceived. Relief agencies, journalists, and foreign governments often assumed the Mafia's presence was incidental or philanthropic. Their contributions to reconstruction, supply distribution, and local development projects created the illusion of legitimacy. Meanwhile, the families were consolidating power, extending their influence over local economies, politics, and social structures. By the end of 2025, it was clear that crisis management had become a cornerstone of the Mafia's strategy. Natural disasters, wars, and political unrest were no longer obstacles. They were opportunities to expand control, wealth, and influence. The ability to operate undetected in areas of chaos proved that the families had evolved beyond conventional crime, mastering subtlety, strategy, and manipulation. As 2026 approached, the Mafia had established itself as a powerful, invisible force capable of turning global crises into instruments of domination, positioning themselves not only as survivors, but as architects of influence in a world increasingly shaped by uncertainty. By the time 2026 approached, the Mafia had transformed into an organization unlike anything the world had ever seen. Gone were the days when its power relied solely on fear, intimidation, or territorial control. The families had evolved into a sophisticated, multi-layered network that operated silently across continents. Their influence extended into finance, politics, technology, and global supply chains, creating a level of power that was nearly impossible to measure or contain. The true strength of the Mafia was no longer visible on the streets. It existed in the systems that shaped economies, governments, and society itself. The families had perfected a method of influence that blended visibility with invisibility. Outwardly, they appeared as entrepreneurs, investors, and philanthropists, moving seamlessly within legal and social frameworks. Behind the scenes, they controlled decisions, redirected resources, and manipulated outcomes to serve their interests. Their reach extended from corporate boardrooms in Europe to shipping ports in South America, from crisis zones in Africa to banking hubs in Asia. Each connection was strategic, creating a network so resilient that disruptions in one area could be absorbed by operations elsewhere. Financial dominance was the cornerstone of their power. Money flowed through legitimate businesses, offshore accounts, and complex digital networks, masking its true origin and purpose. These funds allowed the families to invest in new ventures, fund political campaigns, and secure the loyalty of key individuals in governments and corporations. Unlike previous generations that depended on immediate gains through crime, the Mafia now leveraged wealth to build lasting influence. Every transaction, every investment, and every alliance was part of a broader strategy designed to ensure long-term control over both legal and illegal systems. Political infiltration had reached unprecedented levels. The Mafia held subtle influence over policy decisions, infrastructure projects, and international trade agreements. Officials often acted without realizing that their choices were shaped by forces operating in the shadows. Even when exposed, the families had contingency plans. Insiders, legal loopholes, and digital surveillance systems ensured that investigations were diverted, delayed, or neutralized. The organization's reach was so extensive that traditional law enforcement methods had become largely ineffective. Technology amplified their power further. Encrypted networks, AI-driven analytics, and sophisticated cyber tools allowed the Mafia to monitor threats, predict challenges, and maintain control without physical presence. Operations that once required coordination in person were now executed digitally, making law enforcement interventions increasingly difficult. Every move was calculated, every risk analyzed, and every opportunity exploited with precision. This integration of technology ensured that the families remained several steps ahead of authorities at all times. Global crises, from political instability to natural disasters, became instruments of expansion. By controlling supply chains, offering aid, and embedding themselves in reconstruction efforts, the Mafia gained influence over populations, local economies, and governments. Even areas previously considered beyond their reach fell under their shadow. Through strategy rather than violence, the families had created an empire built on dependence, loyalty, and invisibility. Entering 2026, the Mafia was no longer simply a criminal organization. It had become a shadow power capable of shaping the world without ever being seen. Its influence extended far beyond Italy, far beyond Europe, and far beyond traditional definitions of crime. The families had mastered the art of invisibility, control, and strategic manipulation, ensuring that they would remain dominant for years to come. While governments, corporations, and societies debated policy and security, the Mafia moved silently, reshaping the world in its image. What the public saw as ordinary business, charitable work, or political decision-making was often orchestrated by these unseen forces, proving that the Mafia's evolution had reached its most dangerous stage, yet a stage in which power no longer needed to shout to be felt.